Welcome, family and friends, to another edition of Catching Up with Covenant. Today I'm with John Sutton, and we are interviewing Ed and Sue Reynolds. The Reynolds have been members of Covenant for 37 years. Ed and Sue, thank you for taking some time out to do this interview. You all have shared about your neighbors, how they have been looking out after you during this COVID-19 crisis. Tell us a little bit about what they have been doing and how they have been serving you.
Well, mainly they've been getting our groceries, but they will email us when they're getting ready to go to the grocery store, or send us a text, and then we email them a list, and then they give us a text when they leaving the grocery store and tell us how much they spent, and then I write a check and I set it out on top of the wood box by the side door, and they pick up the check and leave the groceries. And it works pretty well.
That is awesome. So you definitely have a great, you all have a great system.
Well, and that was Jennifer McDaniel from next door delivered just a few minutes before this interview started, and she is assistant headmaster at the Episcopal St. George's Episcopal School here in Griffin. And then on the other side are the Slagles, and Amy Slagles is about to retire from Rehoboth Middle School here, and that is this what became of the school that I retired from. Taylor Street moved to Rehoboth, and that's where she's retiring from. And her husband, we had a huge oak tree that we had to cut down, and I paid for the cutting down. I think I'm going to owe Thomas a considerable amount because he has split up the entire trunk of that oak tree into about 4 cords of firewood. So we are well fixed for the winter time, and he is also in the process of cleaning up our front yard, and it just just doing things for us that I couldn't do any longer. And then the Barrows around the corner, he is teaches U.S. history now at over in Henry County, and his children baked 2 cakes for us, and they are also they call when they're going to the store. So we are well taken care of, and everybody, and I might add too that it's real nice to be able to go out on our deck in the back, and we're close enough to our neighbors to where we can talk back and forth and so forth. So it's not, I think if we were in a 1-bedroom apartment, we'd be in serious trouble.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. Some of our Covenant family and friends may or may not know this, but your house is pretty much a museum. So tell us, we could spend all day, truth be told, and John and I did spend a couple hours one time with you as you showed us your house and showed us some of your artifacts that you have at your house. So we could spend all day looking through your house and be amazed with all the history that is there. But do you have a few artifacts that are near and dear to your hearts that you all are grateful and thankful that you have and you talk about? And
I bet that's Steve. That's our son.
No, it's not. It's Albany, Georgia.
That's Jenny. This is another cousin who is in Albany. Excuse me.
Jenny. Oh.
Yeah, we need to talk to them.
They're part of the interview now too.
All right. See what you need. Hello, Brad?
Hey, can I speak to Miss Jehamiah Smith?
Who?
Miss Jehamiah Smith?
Oh, I thought this was Brad or Jenny. You got the wrong number.
Don't cut this out.
No,
Okay, we'll do. All right,
Don't,
thank you.
please
Thank you.
cut this out.
I'm sorry. That probably ought to go in the kitchen. You were asking, can you edit that out?
Well, he can, but the
We're
question is,
keeping it.
It was a call from Albany, and I've got cousins in Albany. I've got cousins all over the world. And so I assumed it was Jenny, and then it was a guy. So I thought that was her brother from Augusta.
But it was a wrong number.
That's
So
great.
anyway, getting back to a particular artifact, I've got a portrait of Alexander H. Stevens that was done when he was a congressman, painted in about 1850. And he and Abraham Lincoln belonged to a group in Congress called the Young Indians. They were both Whigs, and they were opposed to anything that President Polk was for. They opposed the Mexican War, among other things, but they became extremely good friends. And I have a copy. That's our regular phone.
And it's out of area that's stupid.
Just see if you can cut it. Golly.
I'm going to answer it and cut him off.
Okay. That's our landline, and we really can't do anything about that.
You've got the history and you've got the new stuff in your house. You're on a video call. You answered your smartphone, and you've got a landline.
It reminds me of, I'll have to tell this story about my mother. Mother would take the phone off the hook when she was watching Johnny Carson or whatever. And one of our friends in Atlanta, see, we just lived right at the foot of the hill from her. She lived up the street from us here in Griffin. One of her friends in Atlanta called us that they needed to talk to my mother, and would I please go up there and tell her to put the phone back on the hook? So, maybe we are. I don't know how to do that though with the phone we've got set up now. But anyway.
Going back to our oldest artifact, you got that.
Well, we know we were talking about it in particular. I was going to do the portrait. I could go ahead and just lead back into that. Alexander Stevens portrait that was done in 1850. When he, and actually that was after, because Abraham Lincoln only served one term, but he and Alexander Stevens belonged to a group called the Young Indians. They were both Whigs. They became extremely good friends because of the fact that they were both Whigs. They were both opposed to everything that President Polk was for, including our entry into the Mexican War. But to make a long story short, my great-grandfather, John A. Stevens, was Alexander Stevens' nephew, and he was captured at Port Hudson in Louisiana and imprisoned on Johnson's Island in Lake Erie. And when Alexander Stevens met with Abraham Lincoln in February of 1865 to see if they could come to a peaceful conclusion to the war, of course they couldn't, but Lincoln asked Stevens, said, "Is there anything I could do for you as a friend?" And Stevens said, "Well, my nephew is in prison on Johnson's Island in Lake Erie. If you could just let him know that the family is all right and safe." Well, my great-grandfather was summoned to the commandant's office and shown a telegram from the President of the United States that demanded his release and that he be sent to Washington, D.C. as fast as possible. So in February of 1865, Lake Erie was frozen over, and they took him wrapped up in buffalo robes because he was still in his Confederate summer uniform. They wrapped him up in buffalo robes and took him across the ice to Sandusky, Ohio, and sent him to Washington, D.C. by train. And he was ushered into a room with Abraham Lincoln and Secretary Seward. And he said that Lincoln was the tallest person that he had ever come in contact with. And Lincoln wrote a letter to Alexander H. Stephens explaining the release of his nephew. And the original of that is at the Hargrett Library at the University of Georgia. But I've got a photostat of the letter that looks exactly like the original, along with, and as my great-grandfather was leaving the interview with Lincoln, Lincoln pulled out a carte de visite. It was a little picture of himself that he would use in visiting. He said, and handed it to my great-grandfather, said, "I don't suppose you've got very many of these down south." And that is also with the letter.
Ed, you might mention, a lot of people don't know that Alexander H. Stephens was vice
President of the Confederacy. And he served in Congress before the war. And then he was also elected after the war. And anyway, I guess I could go into the fact too that he was elected to the Senate by the state legislature from Georgia. And when he went to Washington, D.C., they refused to seat him. And General Grant and his wife were having a party that evening. And General Grant had met Alexander Stephens when he was there to confer with Abraham Lincoln and Seward at Hampton Roads, and had been very impressed with him. So the Grants made Alexander Stephens the guest of honor at their party in Washington, D.C. that evening. Wow. That's so anyway, but that's just one of the, and two, my grandfather, my great grandmother was, Alexander Stephens was a bachelor. So she was his hostess at the governor's mansion in Atlanta. And my grandfather and his older brother, their grandfather's earliest recollection was living at the governor's mansion in Atlanta. And his brother locked him out of the house, and he was banging on the door and ringing the doorbell. And Alexander Stephens, our governor, said he was going to have one of the servants whip those boys. And my great-grandmother said, "If you lay a hand, if anyone other than me or my husband lays a hand on their children, I am gone." So they didn't get a whipping.
Family drama from the mid-1800s.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for sharing all of that. What is one of your oldest artifacts that you all have?
Let's see if you can see this. I grew up knowing that this, well, we always called it an Indian lamp. When there was the Creek Cession and Wilkes County was added to the state of Georgia, and my great-grandfather found this lamp on the land that he had gotten in Wilkes County in Washington, Georgia. And it was supposedly an Indian lamp. Well, about 10 years ago, over at Indian Springs, they had some archaeologists over there to identify artifacts. So I took this over there, and it's not an Indian lamp. This came from the Middle East and is BC would be the date. This would be a lamp of the time of Jesus's time, and it's the handle right here would be is broken off, and you would put like olive oil in here, and I actually loaded here. There would be a wick in here, and this is from the Bible.
Wow.
I mean, this, and
That's awesome.
how it ever wound up in Washington, Georgia, and see the evidently, very possibly, our Indians, the Cherokees, this would have been from the Creeks. It was a Creek session, but very possibly the Creeks were trading with, I mean, somehow this got to Wilkes County from the Middle East a long, long time ago.
Well, not even just to Wilkes County, but then from Wilkes County to Griffin. And now you're showing it to us. Like, that's incredible.
But I mean, this is at least 2,000 years old. And as
So
I
do
say,
you keep that? Do you keep it like in a case or anything, or is it just sitting out on the shelf like normal?
It's in the display.
I've got a display case that has all kinds of, I've got my great grandfather's Confederate belt buckle in there, along with, and something else that might be of interest that's in that case. My father's younger brother was named Edward Howell Reynolds, and I am named for him, and he was named for our great grandfather, Edward Howell Myers, who was president of Wesleyan. But anyway, I won't go into all. But when Kennesaw Mountain Landis made the papers, he was a judge in, actually in Illinois, but he lived in LaPorte, Indiana. And he fined Standard Oil Company, I believe it was $425 million in a trust suit, and made the papers. Well, my uncle Edward saw that Kennesaw Mountain Landis spelled his name with one N instead of two. And so he got a postcard from Marietta and mailed it to Kennesaw Mountain Landis. I have the letter that Kennesaw Mountain Landis wrote back to him in 1907, and that's the first baseball card, because Kennesaw Mountain Landis is the first commissioner of baseball. And his fame, when the Black Sox scandal occurred in the, and that's Shoeless Joe Jackson and all of that, Kennesaw Mountain Landis was made commissioner of baseball to clean up baseball. So I've got that. I have the letter from Kennesaw Mountain Landis before he was the commissioner of baseball. So
That's really awesome.
well,
really awesome.
and two, one of my very treasured possessions is the family Bible that's about 1,700 pages and was published in 1832. I decided, when I decided that I was going to read through the entire Bible, I picked that to do. And I'm glad I did, because there were some notes in there and so forth. And I found my grandfather's uncle's, a little, where his hair is braided. Are you gonna go get that? Yeah, his hair when he was a little baby was probably his first haircut. But that would go back to the 1860s.
Well, and you would know this obviously, but like family Bibles used to be like the historical record.
Well,
for
the
the family.
earliest
You record births and
earliest
deaths and
birth recorded in there
yeah.
is 1815, and the last death is 1922.
Wow.
And this was stuck in the Bible. And it was like a Sunday school
Lesson.
thing where they cut out.
And we don't have enough sunlight to do it, but when you hold this up to the sunlight, the sunlight comes through, and it's Jesus on the wall. And then this is my Uncle Rob Simpson's hair when he was a baby. All of that came from the Bible.
This word is it?
No, we don't. It's fixing to rain, so we don't have enough sunlight to do it. But I assumed that was, it says our Savior is I don't know if you can read that, but I guess with a penknife, they cut that out. You can see where somebody drew it with a pen, with a pencil, and then the children, I guess, cut this out. But you, as I say, you hold that up to the light, and it becomes Jesus on the wall.
I wondered if you were going to say that the children held the knives. I didn't know if they passed that. Like today we give them crayons in children's Sunday school, but they had knives. We would get so many more people in children's Sunday school.
They had scissors.
You couldn't do that with scissors. See that all that detail,
Yeah.
you've got to do that with a penknife. But actually, when I was in the second grade, we Cress's 10-cent store in Atlanta, all of us got these knives made in Japan to take to school. And it came for 25 cents. It had a chain on it, so you could hook the chain into your belt. And I forget who the first one that got one, but all of us made a run on Cress's that Saturday, or at least that was when I did. And we all very proudly showed off our pocket knives at school on Monday, and nobody even thought anything about it. And now, good night, you get at least 10 days in school, if not kicked out for a month.
I think now you get kicked out forever, don't you?
Yeah.
Like you can't even return after 10 days. You've got to stay out forever. Well, Ed and Sue, thank you for taking some time and for doing this interview. I feel like we could talk to you all day long.
I would like to, you mentioned something about Georgia history, and I was just going to give you one little thing. Alexander Stephens in 1869 was in his farm, and an iron gate fell on him, and from that point on, he was either in a wheelchair or on crutches. And at his funeral, Woodrow Wilson, future president, was in his law office in Atlanta, and the funeral procession was coming by, and Alexander Stephens' replacement was Governor McDaniel. And Governor McDaniel was at Gettysburg and had most of his lower jaw shot off. The notation in Woodrow Wilson's diary said, "We're burying a governor that couldn't walk, and he's being replaced by one that can't talk."
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Well, on that note, I do want to thank you and Sue for joining us. So thank you. I know you all have a lot of things to do and you're busy folks, and so I appreciate that. And And thank you, family and friends who have joined us for this edition of Catching Up with Covenant. I pray that you and your families are doing well, you're staying safe, and you are encouraged in the Lord. Until next time.